Today I want to talk about Romantasy, arguably the most successful fiction genre right now in terms of sales, known for its blend of passionate love stories that sometimes admittedly border on melodramatic, and which develop on the background of a fantasy setting, often involving a magical society that has some high-stakes conflict going on or about to happen. To say that it's a divisive genre would be an understatement. The people who love it really love it, and the people who hate it will write paragraphs upon paragraphs about how it's nothing more than fairy porn. There are also people somewhere in between these two extremes who typically criticize the genre for being a little bit too formulaic and not particularly well written all the time, but they're not as loud. And it seems to be the law of the internet that if you're not loud, you're not there. So pretend I didn't mention them. There has been a lot of conversation over the past couple of years about how this genre and romance in general might be harmful to its readers and might also negatively impact literature in general. And I do think that both of those conversations are super valid and interesting to have. But in this video, I would like to focus not so much on trying to defend or disparage the genre and its readers, but more so try to think about why this genre is so popular and what its popularity, which is huge, tells us about how women, who represent the vast majority of Romantasy readers, view love and romantic relationships today. I was inspired to make a video about Romantasy from this particular angle by a study called The End of Romance, in which two American sociologists analyzed romantic movies through the decades, starting with the 1930s, all the way up to the rom-com boom of the 1990s, in an attempt to figure out how societal attitudes towards love and relationships have changed over time. I think that if a study like this were done today, it would have to include Romantasy novels or their TV and film adaptations, of which there are a lot in the works right now. I'm no sociologist, but in my opinion, if such a study existed, I think it would find that it's not so much that women read Romantasy to escape the reality of their love life or lack thereof, but rather I think that Romantasy novels represent the negative image of what modern dating is like. So I think that taking a closer look at the Romantasy novel and what it offers its reader can give us some insight into how women today view relationships, gender roles within a relationship, and more generally, the modern dating landscape. And that's exactly what we're going to do after we say thank you to today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is Odoo, an all-in-one management software that offers 45 easy-to-use applications designed to make the day-to-day management of your business simpler. Recently, I've been using the Projects app, which is great for breaking down a big project, setting deadlines, and organizing your resources. I used it, for example, to break down the process of making this video into 5 stages: research, scripting, creating the visuals, which are the images and texts you see on the screen, and then, of course, recording and editing. Under each stage, I can add various tasks, like, for example, finding primary sources and reading and summarizing them. Also, obviously, recording, creating the visuals, and so on. And because I sometimes work with a researcher, I love the fact that the app allows me to assign a task to them, set a deadline to it so that they know when they need to do it, and depending on how big a task is, I can also break it down into multiple subtasks. I also like to include links to all of the source materials, which you can add in the task description so that it's easier for everybody involved to have access to all the various texts. Within each task, I'm also able to send emails, log notes, or attach files so that everything stays centralized through the chatter. And I can also switch between different views such as the Kanban, the list, or Gantt view. The Projects app is just one of a wide-ranging selection of apps that you can find on Odoo, all of which seamlessly communicate with each other and bring together all you need for the day-to-day running of your business, including invoicing, accounting, project management, inventory, website creation, and more. The first app on Odoo is Free for Life with unlimited hosting and support, and Odoo is also scalable, which means that as your business grows, you can always switch to their affordable subscription and add more apps. So if you're looking for a simpler way to work, follow the link in the description for your first free app. Thank you so much, Odoo, for sponsoring this video, and thank you for listening. Before I get into my various theories about feminist media critique, irony culture, dating apps, and the Gen Z obsession with nonchalance, and how they all converged to make straight women feel like dating is pointless, so they might as well just experience love vicariously through their favorite half-human, half-fairy warrior princess. I want to talk first about the two more obvious factors that contributed to the rise in popularity of Romantasy. The first one being that fantasy fiction is wildly popular with adult audiences and has been for quite some time. One of the common observations that people make when they talk about the rise in popularity of Romantasy is that it started to grow during and immediately after the pandemic, when people were mainly reading and watching things as a form of escapism. Statements like, "With the stress of the last few years, it's understandable that people have wanted to distance themselves from the real world and bring a little bit more magic into their lives," have become a permanent fixture, it seems, to Romantasy commentary. And because it seems like the pandemic is over but the geopolitical horrors persist, a lot of people have continued to pinpoint escapism as one of the primary factors when it comes to the success of Romantasy. As recently as November 2024, The Guardian published an opinion piece titled, "Of course the girls are reading horny fairy books. It's cheaper than travel and more fun than therapy," in which the writer at one point observes, "At a time when people are turning up to hospital with scurvy and when a cursory glance at the news shows the impact of climate change are here, staying home on the couch reading about dragons is about as good as a holiday." But what I think it's interesting about the article is that further down in it, the author shifts the focus from escapism from big world events to escapism from one's personal life. Of all the people I know who have read dozens of these smutty fantasy books and share the obsession, they mostly have senior jobs, stressful workloads, and significant responsibilities. I think that the second observation about escapism touches on an aspect of it that is important in my opinion, and that is that it doesn't only manifest in relation to public life. People can also want an escape from their personal reality, even when the world is not on fire. And in addition to this, trying to place escapism in a cause and effect relationship to world events like the pandemic or the genocide in Gaza or the rise of populism in the West overlooks a pretty relevant fact. Fantasy literature and its film and TV adaptations were already super popular way before any of these events took place and began to occupy such a central place in the collective consciousness. I know the finale was so bad that we all like to pretend that it never happened, but remember Game of Thrones? I'm sure we all do, because it was the biggest show on television for years, and as this one 2019 article puts it, it opened the floodgate for a plethora of other fantasy TV shows. The show first aired in April 2011 to immediate and overwhelming success, which TV executives have been trying to replicate ever since. Between American Gods, The Wheel of Time, The Witcher, Shadow and Bone, His Dark Materials, not to mention the Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones spin-offs, the past decade of television has introduced a whole new demographic to fantasy fiction. So with this in mind, it's a little bit less surprising to me that Romantasy took off in the way that it did, because it is basically blending romance, which has always been a commercially successful genre, with fantasy at a time when high fantasy TV was just coming down from its peak popularity. This is not to say that if you combine any two universally well-liked things, the result will be a guaranteed success. I like olives and I like ice cream, but I don't want to eat olive ice cream. Which brings me to the second more obvious reason why Romantasy is so successful, which is that, in my opinion, fantasy media has always had an erotic and romantic dimension to it. And I don't just mean people cosplaying as their favorite fantasy character in the bedroom or hooking up at the Renaissance fair. Although, I don't kink shame. And it is true that many Romantasy readers and writers have talked about the way in which these books have become safe spaces for readers to explore their own fantasies in an unapologetic way, as well as an excuse to bring up sex, which is a traditionally more taboo topic, with their partners or even their friends, and compare notes and experiences and expand their understanding of what a healthy sex life looks like. But when I say that the fantasy genre is inherently romantic, what I mean is that it allows for drama. In The End of Romance, the study that I mentioned earlier, the authors point out that there are two main ingredients for the creation of a compelling romance movie: obstacles, and transgression. To be of interest to the reader or viewer, and one might speculate to the lovers themselves, romance must constitute a struggle against some outside force that, intentional or not, serves to separate the lovers and in other ways make difficult the progress of their love. The main examples of external forces or impediments given in this study are war and social segregation based on class or ethnicity, the classics. But they also observe that as society has thankfully evolved past certain social injustices and taboos, the opportunities for a difficult romance story have become few and far between. Although examples of racism are unfortunately not hard to find even today, interracial relationships are no longer criminalized or ostracized in the way that they used to be. Ending a marriage to enter a new relationship, although still super painful, is no longer something that will get you excommunicated from your social circle in the way that it used to do before the normalization of divorce. And when it comes to interclass relationships, at least in the West, there's basically no issue. The only recent rom-com that I can think of where the premise is that the relationship between a super rich person and an average middle class person is difficult is Crazy Rich Asians. And I think it's telling that, as the title suggests, it wasn't enough for the person to be rich, they had to be crazy rich in order for the plot to be believable. So unsurprisingly, the first finding of the End of Romance study was that since the end of World War II, the ratio of romantic comedies to romantic dramas has increased steadily as the number of plausible barriers that might keep the star-crossed lovers apart and that doom both their relationship and their health and happiness has dwindled considerably. The rom-com still had obstacles, otherwise there would be no movie, no plot. But they were no longer these great external forces. Rather, they were internal to the relationship, like a miscommunication between the lovers, or maybe one of them was not emotionally available, or maybe there's a love triangle. In any case, all of these things are a lot easier to overcome from a dramatic standpoint. Perhaps too easy. So when you take a story with an already relatively simple issue and add to it the extra layer of convenience that we are afforded today by communication technology, for example, the narrative arc of a love story becomes kind of anticlimactic. It really becomes a matter of if he wanted to, he would. And this has kind of become the unofficial refrain of modern dating culture. If they wanted to, they would. We have the communication technology, we have the time, and we have the vocabulary to talk about our emotions or whatever other issues might come up in an interpersonal relationship. Because now everyone is constantly on their phone and over communicating, and because of social media, everyone, at the very least, seems knowable, even if they're not. There has been quite a bit of discourse about this in the context of rom-coms. For example, people were talking about how movies like Serendipity wouldn't function today. The movie is about two people who spend an evening together after a chance encounter, and given that they're both in relationships, they decide that they should let the universe decide whether they should be together or not. The woman writes her name and number in a book, which she gives to a secondhand bookstore, and the man writes his on a $5 bill, which immediately gets used to pay for something. So, as the title suggests, they are hoping that a happy coincidence will bring them back together if they are meant to be. Today, this movie would be over in 10 minutes. Another rom-com trope that has become obsolete because of communication technology is the running after the other person before they board the plane or train or bus or whatever it is that they're using to leave town. Now we can just call them, and they will probably just wait for the phone to stop ringing so they can text you to ask you what you want. I recently read a novel called The Material by Camille Bordas about a group of people doing an MFA in comedy at a nameless Chicago university. And at one point in the story, the narration zooms into this one character who is the chief of the English department, and he's teaching a seminar on epiphany. He'd wanted to end his epiphany seminar on a light note. Discuss romantic comedies, make fun of all the running involved in romantic epiphanies. The students hadn't gotten it. When they realized they loved someone, they said this as if it happened to them once a month, they could just text them. I love this book, and I particularly love this paragraph and how well it depicts the essence of what modern dating culture is right now. the complete lack of urgency around relationships, how young people feel like love is at their fingertips and they can find it at any minute. And also the way that we now feel like we don't need to inconvenience ourselves as much to hold on to a relationship. We don't really need to show up physically because we now have the technology that mitigates the uncomfortable aspects of relationships on our behalf. This is, in my opinion, where the fantasy setting comes into play. The fantasy world strips away ease and convenience, and it reintroduces friction into the life of the character. On the more superficial level, you strip away technological convenience and force the characters to interact with each other in a different way by placing them in like a medieval looking type of society where they're not drowning in entertainment and they still have to leave the house to acquire the items needed for day-to-day life as opposed to putting in a Deliveroo order or something. In doing this, the Romantasy author opens their story back up to all of these plotting possibilities for meet cutes and forced proximity and miscommunication and intercepted messages and all of these things that would be much harder to believe in the modern world. On a deeper level, the Romantasy genre can reintroduce friction within the romantic relationship itself, because creating a completely new world with an entire magical system and social structure that involves various anthropomorphous species living side by side gives the writer free rein to imagine new social norms and constraints for the lovers to contend with and fight against. Speaking to The Guardian for an article on the Romantasy boom published last year, the Canadian author Nisha J. Tully said that a key aspect of Romantasy is that romance can have these world-ending stakes that you just can't get with an office rom-com. I love the whole he murdered your whole family, but you're going to fall in love, something which you can only really create in a fantasy world. Obviously, the scenario that she presents here is a bit of an exaggeration, but I do think that this type of over-the-top, high-stakes, dramatic romance is something that has been completely missing from popular culture for nearly a decade. And more generally speaking, pretty much any sincere depiction of romantic love had kind of completely disappeared from popular culture. I've seen a lot of people talk about this in the context of romantic comedies. Since the release of Anyone But You starring Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell in 2023, various media outlets and content creators have been celebrating what they consider to be a rom-com renaissance. And discussions about this renaissance often include an analysis of why the rom-com had kind of disappeared from cinemas in the later half of the 2010s. There is a practical reason for this, which has been written about extensively by the TV and film critic Scott Meslow in his book From Hollywood with Love. He explains that at the time, the general approach to movie making that studios operated under was to essentially throw a bunch of money at franchisable blockbuster type productions like the superhero sagas. So on average, there was less money for mid-budget movies, of which the rom-com represented a huge percentage. And this meant that a lot of talented writers stopped working in the genre because there was nothing in it for them anymore. And because talented people weren't working on them anymore, the scripts of the rom-com that were written at the time were lower quality, which resulted in fewer big-name, cool actors wanting to be attached to these projects. And so the message that audiences received from this was that if cool actors didn't want to be attached to rom-coms anymore, then it must mean that it wasn't cool to like rom-coms. Another thing that I've seen critics and essayists talk about in the context of the disappearance of the rom-com is the rise in feminist media critique of the 2010s. In her video, Why Rom-Coms Are Not Romantic Anymore, Mina Lay refers to a Jezebel article published in 2013 which deconstructed all of the romantic storylines in the Love Actually movie through a feminist lens. I wasn't living in an English-speaking country when this article came out, so I wasn't super clued in to Western online culture, but I am definitely familiar with spoofs of that one cue card scene, and I'm also familiar with the way that for a while it was a very popular thing in internet culture to deconstruct classic love stories in literature and cinema through a feminist framework. I obviously agree that this wave of feminist media critique was very much warranted. It's important to look at the way that the media we are exposed to reinforces gender stereotypes in romantic relationships and societal norms, and to question those stereotypes and norms. And it's also important to tell stories where romantic relationships are not at the center of the protagonist's life every now and then, because in real life, romantic relationships are not everything. But I also agree with the many people who in more recent years have observed that once we deconstructed the rom-com, there was no sincere depiction of romantic love to take its place. All the rom-coms that we were left with were incredibly self-aware, to the point where they seemed like they were cringing at their own existence. And the reality that they depicted was so irony-led that there seemed like there was no room for love in the world that they created. And more to the point, it seemed like romantic love was not compatible with modern life, and that the desire for a romantic relationship and companionship was not compatible with the modern woman. Which brings me back to the topic of this video, the current dating scene, women opting out of romantic relationships and seeking comfort in romantasy novels. I don't think it's a coincidence that as the rom-com faded from cultural relevance and even became this thing that we all made fun of, romance in general became less and less of a priority in the lives of young people. That being said, I also don't want to overstate the importance of the media that we are exposed to. I'm not suggesting that suddenly when there were no more movies to model how to be in relationships, people kind of couldn't figure it out anymore. Also, as previously discussed, the reason why rom-coms as a genre got so picked apart was because some of the stories that they were depicting were built almost entirely on antiquated stereotypes about men and women anyway. But I still think that the shift in attitudes towards the rom-com of the mid to late 2010s was a sort of first fall of a domino piece towards what the dating landscape is today, which people are describing as currently suffering from a nonchalance epidemic. I've seen a lot of content recently about this so-called nonchalance epidemic, a sort of emotional atrophy that seems to be plaguing younger millennials and Gen Z and rendering them incapable of having satisfying romantic relationships. A lot of what I've read so far describes the nonchalance epidemic as a consequence of the pandemic and the social isolation that came with it, and I agree that it was a huge factor, but I do think that there are other things preceding the pandemic that have brought us here. The most obvious of them being the introduction of dating apps as the primary mode of connecting with people with the purpose of finding romantic relationships. The apps were fun to begin with, but soon enough, people started to feel the effects of how they gamified dating and became more of a tool for individuals to boost their self-esteem rather than seek actual connection, ultimately making everybody involved feel unwanted and disposable. Recently, there has been a lot of discussion about how dating apps are essentially failing because instead of nurturing connections between people, they're creating the illusion that there's an unlimited number of potential matches out there, which doesn't really incentivize users to make an effort to actually get to know each other. Another cultural phenomenon that started gaining traction around this time was the rise of self-improvement and hustle culture gurus who disseminated their teachings via social media and encouraged their followers to focus on themselves, which sounds good in theory, but oftentimes, this particular brand of self-improvement and self-care prioritized the self in response to rejection from others. The message wasn't focus on yourself so that you can become a better person, but rather focus on yourself to become unrecognizable, to make them regret ever hurting you, to shock everyone, or to prove them wrong. In a thesis titled Neoliberal Love and the Pathology of Gen Z Singledom and published in 2023 at the University of Pennsylvania, the author Talia Feaster analyzed dating content on TikTok in an effort to better understand Gen Z attitudes to love and relationship. One of her findings, among other things, was that TikTok hyper-individualism manifests as a constant pursuit to making oneself into a more interesting package. Focus on yourself, go to the gym, learn how to do your hair and makeup better, earn more money to buy nicer clothes. It may appear like self-improvement, but really it is done in response to romantic disappointment and with the hope of attracting better partners in the future. Over the past few years, I've seen this type of attitude being pushed really hard by super popular dating coaches who promise their viewers that if they master what they call the art of detachment, they will somehow manifest the perfect relationship as a result. I don't chase, I attract has become a popular way of thinking on social media right now because it sounds like it's based on some greater philosophical or spiritual truth, while also conveniently sparing us the risk of putting ourselves out there and trying to pursue a relationship to then be embarrassed when that relationship attempt fails. It's very interesting how new age spiritual concepts such as manifestation and even therapy speak are constantly being molded to create new ways for people to protect themselves from getting their feelings hurt, or worse, getting embarrassed, which in the age of social media cringe is like the worst thing that could possibly happen to a person, it seems. Writer and podcaster Liz Plank recently referred to the desire to appear nonchalant as a state of emotional underfunctioning. We're living in a moment of emotional underfunctioning, a vibe shift where dating has become something closer to performance art, an endless exchange of glances and memes and left swipes, calibrated to avoid the horror of being the one who cares more. According to a Pew study, 63% of single Americans aren't even looking for a relationship. Bumble just laid off a third of its staff. Even casual hookups are in decline. We're not falling in love. We're not even trying. She continues, it's an ambient fear of vulnerability so culturally omnipresent that it started to feel natural. Like love should be chill and casual and entirely unspoken, like the only way to be safe is to never say what you want out loud. The entire romantic landscape has become one long standoff. Don't text first, don't double text, don't get too excited, don't ask too many questions, don't let anyone know that you care, at least not before they do. We're not dating each other so much as running parallel simulations of desire, carefully curated to look effortless. So on the background of this emotional desert, my great overarching theory, in case you haven't figured that out by now, is that romance fiction and romantasy in particular has become so popular in direct reaction to this. A social media trend that I've seen a lot in the past year or so, both on Instagram and on TikTok, is women taking pictures of their favorite male love interest and posting them with the caption, "Bring back yearning," or something to that effect. The characters are typically male leads from classic romance stories that millennial and Gen Z women consider to represent the opposite type of relationship to the ones that they have experienced in real life. In the context of their respective novels, each of these men is uniquely dedicated to the woman that he fell in love with, usually the female protagonist, forsaking all others and continuing to love her from afar even when she doesn't know about his feelings, or when, because of a crisis in the relationship, she has withdrawn her affection from him. A related trend is the slogan, "The best men are fictional," and other variations on this theme, through which young women highlight the dedication to love of fictional men in contrast to that aforementioned nonchalance ubiquitous in modern dating. Yearning is the opposite of nonchalance and also one of the primary components in a romantasy narrative. The examples of men I've used on screen thus far are not from romantasy stories because there haven't been any major live actions produced yet, but the romantasy novel places itself in direct opposition to nonchalance. First and foremost, there isn't really such a thing as dating around in romantasy. There are love triangles every now and then, but they typically center around the female protagonist. She is the one who needs to make up her mind to make a choice, not the one waiting around for a choice to be made. Another characteristic of the romantasy love story is that even when the attraction between the main couple is somewhat at odds with the rules of the world that they exist within, there is still a sense that their love is destined. It's often part of a greater design and therefore guaranteed to survive every obstacle. And sometimes falling in love and being transformed by that love is even necessary to the survival of the world or society that the lovers exist within. It might be predictable, but it's cathartic, and in my opinion, also a clear reaction to the minefield of ambiguity and ambivalence that is modern dating. The satisfying, albeit formulaic nature of romantasy offers some respite from the unknowables of modern life. A key thing to note about romantasy, though, is that for all that the romantasy novel centers yearning and effort and a sincere and steadfast approach to love, it also shifts the onus of the emotional labor required to keep a relationship alive from the woman onto the man. It seems like when romantasy readers say bring back yearning, what they mean is that they want to feel yearned for, not do the yearning themselves. This reminded me of something that gets talked about a lot in the context of heterosexual relationships and their dynamic, and that is the concept of heteropessimism. The term was first coined by Asa Saracen to describe performative disaffiliations with heterosexuality, usually expressed in the form of regret, embarrassment, or hopelessness about the straight experience. Saracen observed, "It's almost taboo, from what I've seen, both online and in my real life, to express straightforward desire for men that doesn't have the caveat of being like, men are trash, or I kind of hate men." And I thought that this was interesting because recently I've seen an increasing number of women talk about this embarrassing experience of putting oneself out there and feeling like there are no good men. A distinct aspect of heteropessimism is the feeling that women are expected to single-handedly make a relationship happen by coaching the men that they are dating through their feelings about them and the relationship without scaring them away. There is a sense of embarrassment around this, reflected in the thousands of pieces of content from women describing the choice to give up dating altogether because they feel exhausted by the whole process. But giving up is obviously not a one-fits-all solution. Writer and podcaster Nicole Ochran recently published an essay titled Heterofatalism, The Politics of Waiting and Wanting, in which she observes, with calls to decenter men and practice detachment, pursue careers and hobbies, work on fitness goals, start therapy, create community, women are told to create full and enriching lives outside of their relationship status. But what do you do if you've done it all and you still want a man lying next to you at night? Because worse than being a single woman is being the single woman painted as desperate. I read a Guardian op-ed about romantasy recently, which I thought was very good at expressing that finding love is not the main aspect of the female fantasy that romantasy caters to. The romantasy novel also creates a world in which women are free from the emotional labor that they are expected to carry out in a real-life romantic relationship, without having to give up on relationships altogether. The romantasy protagonist still wants to be in love. She wants sex and she wants companionship, but she also has a bunch of other things going on. The romantasy heroine speaks to the cultural moment. The strong female-led stories show young women can be nerdy and sexy, vulnerable and powerful, both not that girl and that girl. You can be Glinda and Elphaba, Chapel Roan and Taylor Swift. You can be anyone or anything you please. This is the fantasy. Whether this fantasy is something that young women should want for themselves or yet another continuation of unrealistic societal expectations for women to be everything at once is another also very interesting conversation to be had. But for this video, I just wanted to add a different perspective to the romance and romantasy literature discourse because I think that it's very tempting to just engage with this literature in terms of whether it's good or bad and not so much question why it's so popular. And more generally, I just think it's so easy to criticize the things that women like and do without actually engaging with those things. We periodically see people build entire social media careers around making fun of pick-me girls or judging which women are girls and which aren't. I've also recently noticed a new thing where women use the term male-centered as an insult for each other, and it's giving me flashbacks to not that long ago when people were using the term male gaze or for the male gaze as a pretentious way of saying that women's outfits were slutty. And this is not to say that women can't be villains or can't like or do things that are wrong, but the way that we so quickly bypass trying to understand women's preferences and behaviors and immediately move on to policing them is a little bit dystopian. It's like we just never learn anything. Anyways, I'm going to step off my soapbox now and say thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.